O Brasil está vivendo uma crise. Os desafios do século XXI agravam problemas sociais históricos. A pandemia revela mais desigualdades e torna a transformação social ainda mais urgente. Entre todos os números que aumentaram nos últimos tempos, uma luz. A ação coletiva e cidadã também disparou e demonstrou a força que a sociedade tem quando se une para trabalhar por um objetivo comum. Nos últimos 25 anos, atuamos como uma plataforma de rede que fortalece a ação da filantropia e do investimento social no país. Impulsionamos a colaboração, produzimos conhecimento, estimulamos a inovação e articulamos diferentes setores geradores de impacto positivo. Muito já foi feito, mas ainda temos muito por realizar. Nos próximos 25 anos, queremos superar as fronteiras da ação coletiva e ser, cada vez mais, a plataforma que acolhe, conecta e ecoa vozes plurais. A nossa força está na diversidade. O 11º Congresso GIFE vai promover o diálogo sobre a expansão da ação cidadã no país, diversificando temas, aprofundando a conexão entre agentes e investidores sociais e contemplando a sociedade em todos os cantos do Brasil.
Olá, pessoal, boa tarde. Eu sou a Érica, sou coordenadora geral do 11º Congresso GIFE, Fronteiras da Ação Coletiva, e estou aqui hoje com a Camila para dar as boas-vindas a todas e a todos. É uma alegria ter vocês com a gente hoje nesse webhour que fecha a série Pautas do Investimento Social.
Oi, boa tarde a todos e todas, um prazer tê-los aqui. Sou Camila Loi, coordenadora de Relações Institucionais no GIFE.
Bom, antes de apresentar a mesa de hoje, eu quero contar um pouco sobre o Congresso, porque esse ano, como não poderia deixar de ser, ele também se adaptou ao nosso contexto e passou de ser um evento de 3 dias para ser um trilho. Esse trilho teve início em agosto, com a semana de abertura, com a Semana do Investimento Social, e a partir dela segue com uma programação contínua de atividades até março do ano que vem, quando teremos o encontro de 3 dias que tradicionalmente caracterizam o Congresso GIFE, mas que nessa edição tem um papel um pouco diferente, porque eles passam a ser a nossa estação de chegada, um momento de consolidação de todo o trilho e o grande encerramento do Congresso, buscando apontar caminhos e pautas prioritárias para o setor da filantropia, do investimento social e para os próximos anos, em diálogo com todos os desafios que a gente tem hoje como sociedade, como país. E ao longo desses meses todos de congresso, a gente organizou a programação em 2 grandes blocos. A série de diálogos e debates que são abertas ao público e os espaços e atividades de intercâmbio e de colaboração, que são as atividades exclusivas para os inscritos do congresso. Na nossa mesa de hoje, a nossa mesa de hoje é parte de uma dessas séries, que é a série de webhour sobre pautas do investimento social. Esse é o 10º e último webhour dessa série. A gente já realizou conversas variadas aqui, então a gente começou lá atrás com uma conversa sobre novos atores e arquiteturas do setor, a gente falou de cooperação territorial, a gente fez um panorama sobre a filantropia pelo Brasil, uma conversa sobre a agenda dos ODS, a sua conexão com o setor, a gente falou sobre marco legal da atuação da sociedade civil no Brasil, falamos sobre fundos patrimoniais, sobre blended finance, sobre filantropia familiar e sobre filantropia e movimentos sociais. E hoje a gente está aqui terminando essa série com uma conversa sobre filantropia pelo mundo. Todos esses debates estão disponíveis no site do Congresso GIFE e do canal no GIFE no YouTube. Então, fica aqui o convite para todos, para que todo mundo possa assistir outros debates que a gente fez aqui no âmbito dessa série, de outras do Congresso, por meio desses canais. A gente vai colocar aqui no chat o link do site do Congresso e o link do canal do GIFE no YouTube. Uma coisa bem importante sobre o debate de hoje é que todos os nossos convidados são convidados internacionais, então eles vão falar em inglês, mas é possível acompanhar toda a conversa em português. Para isso, vocês precisam ativar o botãozinho de tradução. É só vocês olharem aí na tela de vocês, na parte de baixo, tem um botãozinho, que tem um desenho que parece um globo. Vocês podem clicar nesse globinho e escolher o idioma, inglês, português, ou manter ele desligado, que aí vocês ouvem cada um falando na língua que falar. Se vocês quiserem ouvir o tempo inteiro em português, é só escrever em português que vocês vão ouvir os tradutores falando. Como a gente tem feito aqui em várias das mesas do Congresso, a nossa mesa de hoje está sendo realizada em parceria com a Wings. Desculpa, gente. Tem um menininho aqui me pedindo uma coisa. Então, queria muito agradecer a parceria da Wings. A Wings está hoje representada na mesa pela Naila, que é a presidente do conselho da Wings. e toda a equipe da Wings também, que ajudou aqui a pensar enfim, os convidados, o foco do nosso debate de hoje. E com isso, eu também queria agradecer muito, aqui antes de passar para a Camila, todos os nossos palestrantes que estão aqui conosco hoje. Então, a gente tem aqui, além da Naila na mediação, o Charles, o Ivans e o Brad, e a Naina, que não vai poder estar aqui presencialmente, mas que gravou a participação dela, a Naina, que está em Singapura, mas que agora é madrugada lá, então ela não poderá estar aqui com a gente presencial. Então, agora eu vou passar para a Camila, para ela apresentar o foco da mesa de hoje, qual vai ser o nosso debate hoje, e contar um pouco mais sobre cada um dos palestrantes.
Eu estava no mudo. Obrigada, Érica. Então, contando um pouco dessa mesa, né? Porque pensamos na mesa. Então, como todos os demais atores na sociedade, na esfera pública, o universo da filantropia viu-se profundamente desafiado à inovação e multiplicação de esforços diante dos impactos da pandemia em âmbito global. Fechando a série de encontros em torno das fronteiras de ação para a filantropia e o investimento social no país, o webhour buscará trazer um panorama global desses movimentos e mudanças, com vozes dedicadas ao desenvolvimento da filantropia em pontos diversos do planeta, somando-se no compor dessa visão e de seus elos potenciais com as dinâmicas do contexto brasileiro. Para a nossa interação de hoje durante a mesa, a gente vai ter duas formas para vocês poderem interagir com os palestrantes. Então, a primeira delas é vocês enviarem perguntas pelo chat durante toda a mesa. Nós vamos anotar tudo e vamos retomar no final das apresentações com a abertura das perguntas para os palestrantes. A outra forma de participação que os convidamos a se juntar com a gente nessa é a formação da nuvem de palavras. Então, vocês podem tanto acessar esse QR Code que aparece aí na tela, ou então a equipe do GIFE vai colocar no chat também o link para vocês acessarem acessarem esse Mentimeter e poderem responder a pergunta. Considerando o panorama global da filantropia, qual é a principal fronteira no setor em âmbito global? Então, contamos com a participação de vocês para a nossa formação da nuvem global de todos nós. Muito bem, então agora passando para apresentar os palestrantes, então é um prazer apresentar para vocês os palestrantes que hoje estão com a gente nesse webhour. O Brad Smith é presidente da Candid e ex-presidente do Foundation Center. Nós temos também o Charles Caden, que é editor executivo da Alliance Magazine. Evans Oakwin é CEO da East Africa Philanthropy Network. A Nena Sabwal Batra é CEO e presidente da Asia Venture Philanthropy Network. Ela estará em vídeo conosco hoje. E a Naila Farouk, que é CEO do Arab Foundations Forum e presidente do Conselho de Diretores da Worldwide Initiative for Grantmaker Support, a WINGS. É um prazer tê-los todos aqui. Naila, muito obrigada pela sua mediação e eu passo para você, então, a palavra para que você conduza essa mesa. Muito obrigada, um prazer tê-los todos aqui.
Uma ótima mesa, gente.
Uma ótima mesa.
Great. Thank you so much, Camila and Erika. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. So as Camila mentioned, I'm Naila Farouki. I'm the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum, which is a network of Arab donors and foundations, or non-Arab donors and foundations that are making grants in the Arab region. And I also, in today's mediation, I'm coming in the capacity of as the chair of the board of the Wings Network, which is a partner co-hosting this event today. So thank you so much for having me. And I hope that the speakers that we have today are amazing speakers, all of whom have kind of expertise in a different part of the sector, the philanthropy sector. So we're going to be talking with them, just asking a couple of questions about what does philanthropy look like in the next couple of years, and particularly given the situation, this kind of global collective situation that we all find ourselves in. And it's interesting when we talk about this kind of new normal, or what we're calling the new normal. I mentioned this yesterday also in another conference, where I had just read an article the evening before, where the author was telling the public, telling the reader, that we need to stop kind of putting ourselves in this mindset of pausing our lives now and resuming into a new normal later, because the fact is that this is normal. What is today, what's happening today is our new normal, right? And so that this idea, this mindset of let's pause and wait until when we can return to normal, we need to sort of shift that thinking a little bit and accept the fact that we are currently living our normalcy. And so, maybe try to adapt to that rather than pausing our lives and thinking that things will go back to normal, right? And so I think that kind of brings the question and begs the question of what is this normal? What does that mean? What does it look like? What does it look like for us personally? And then what does it look like for us professionally? And how do we adapt our personal and professional lives to continue to be effective, to continue to be impactful, but also taking into consideration the realities of the situation that we're in. So, for instance, that kind of begs questions of, do we travel less? Do we do more meetings by Zoom? Maybe yes or no, I'm not sure. Do we make more of a concerted effort to build partnerships globally so that we can have a network where we can leverage, those relationships so that we can try to make impact on a global scale rather than have to be everywhere physically? What does it take to foster and nurture those collaborations? What does it take to foster and nurture those relationships in a time when we may not be able to make those connections in a more physical space? So those are all kind of big overarching questions. And I'll just go right into our first round of questions for our panelists, for our speakers. And as Camila may have mentioned, or I'm not sure if it was Camila or Erica, but mentioned that one of our speakers, Naina Batra, is not actually going to be physically with us. So she has a pre-recorded intervention. So I'll start off with the first question, which lays out the fact that, okay, 2020 was a very critical year for the philanthropy sector, and critical both in a positive sense and in maybe a not so positive sense. This pandemic has had a very obvious impact on all sectors globally, on all, the entire global population. So in a way, there's a bit of a comfort in that, right? Knowing that we're kind of all in this together. And considering the experience of each one of you speakers, both your personal and professional experience, and regarding the different regions where you're working, I wonder if you could share a little bit about what were, maybe the top 2-3 impacts, changes that you've seen that have caused you to reconsider your strategic agendas, to consider your strategies of action and your philanthropic action, or what you're seeing as kind of those impacts on the sector. And then if you could just pinpoint, what the main challenges were, and I'd, stay to 2 or 3, and what in your view are the main priorities to address moving forward. So if you can just bring, your kind of your personal experience, your personal expertise. And I wonder if maybe first we can go to Naina's pre-recorded question, and then I'll bring it back and ask the next 2 speakers. Thank you.
Hello from Asia. My name is Naina Sabarwal Batra, and I'm the CEO and chairperson of AVPN, which is the largest social investing platform in Asia. We have more than 600 members who deploy all kinds of capital, from grants to debt to equity, and together in 2019-2020 deployed more than $12 billion towards impact in Asia. First question. 2020 was a very important year for the philanthropic sector around the world. The pandemic has had an impact on all sectors globally. Considering the experience of each one of you and the regions where you're working, what were the impacts and changes caused on strategic agendas, strategies of action and thematics of the philanthropic action? What are the main challenges and what are the main priorities? So we found that there was a lot of noise and misinformation when the pandemic broke, and we found that we had the ability to leverage our position as a network in order to highlight what were the key issues across Asia, and aggregate all the efforts of our members in tackling that pandemic under different themes onto one platform. So this platform was the COVID Action Platform that AVPN launched very early on when the pandemic hit. By launching the platform, our members were able to make informed decisions on who the different players were in different Asian countries, where there were collaboration opportunities, and what were the missing gaps. Within 3 months of us putting together this COVID Action Platform, we realized that our members had mobilized more than $10 billion worth of capital into COVID-19 relief and recovery efforts. I think one of the biggest changes we saw throughout the ecosystem was a behavioral one. Funders and resource providers found that collaboration was the only way to go, as it was definitely not effective to work in silos and recreate the wheel with disparate initiatives. A couple of examples of collaboration that I would like to share with you is firstly around the Philippines, where Project Ugnayan was led by the 20 largest corporations in the Philippines, many of whom are AVPN members. This collaboration came together very early on and was designed to provide food and basic necessities to the poor living in Manila and other urban areas. AVPN ourselves also partnered with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to support India's poorest communities by bringing in fellow members like the Temasek Foundation and the Harish and Beena Shah Foundation to provide personal protective equipment and testing kits, again quite early on in the pandemic. Even with the early efforts, we find that going forward, collaboration is very important. Although we are hearing in recent days about the efforts of various global vaccine manufacturers to launch vaccines, we see that there will be a shortage of more than 2 billion doses a year for annual vaccination programs. One of our members' path is ensuring the long-term supply of vaccines for low and middle income countries, particularly countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Brazil, by partnering with both governments as well as vaccine manufacturers in these different countries. And we are helping them to look for more funding to boost distribution efforts. Knowledge sharing is extremely important, and we are seeing strong solidarity more than ever before. AVPN brought together a global community of social investors by working with our sister networks like Latimpacto, EVPA, and AVPA to learn and share lessons from grant makers and investors across the world. Within Asia, we saw that China is also committed to building bridges with the rest of Asia by facilitating two-way communications and exchanges of innovative models and best practices.
Okay, so I guess that's the end of Naina's video. So I'm actually, I mean, unfortunately, since she's not here so we can kind of, speak to her one-on-one, I'll just move to the next speaker, and then maybe we can do some, recap. If I can ask Evans to come on, please, and I'll pose the same question to you, Evans, if you can just give us, in your view and in your experience, what have you seen as the impact that this pandemic has had in your work, and what would you say were your top kind of 3 challenges as well as top 3 priorities in terms of how to mitigate these challenges? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neela, and quite a pleasure to be part of this conversation. Let me take a minute to just talk about what EAPN is. I work with the East Africa Philanthropy Network, which is a network of trusts, foundations, and other organizations which are in the philanthropic space in the 3-4 East African countries of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. We focus majorly on generating knowledge for the sector, promoting and enabling building of alliances. So the issue around partnerships and collaborations. The third thing is creation of an enabling environment for philanthropy. And lastly, strengthening of institutions. And so with the coming of COVID-19 and the pandemic that the globe is currently facing, convening our membership to just learn and support them in dealing with the situation that we are currently having, we've learned a lot of things. And we've also supported the sector to respond to the challenges which are there in quite a number of ways. But to answer your question, in one of the surveys that we did somewhere in the month of August, we found out that there was a lot of shift within the grant-making space in terms of allocation of resources. And we found out, if you can just allow me to give you the exact figures, out of the membership of EAPN, 42% of the members redirected their existing program funds to support COVID-19. 47% of them decreased their funding to the various programs that they were supporting before the pandemic. 31% increased their funding, 15% got total cutoff on ongoing grant support, and 5% did not in any way, the pandemic did not affect their funding in any way in the program areas that they were supporting. And so looking at that shift in allocation of funds, now as EAPN and as builders of the ecosystem in the region, it made us now shift our focus, because little funding was coming from the developed economies or from the West to the East African region. And so that meant that we had to now shift our thinking and our approach into mobilizing local resources. So we had to tap into, individual giving, community giving, private sector giving, to fill that gap which was existing, but also support the government efforts to meet the pandemic challenges that came along. So that is one area. And in that effect, there was a lot of initiatives which were created. One of them is what we call the NBCC, the National Business Compact on Coronavirus. Now, this we facilitated, and it brought together the philanthropy sector, the private sector, and government, together with other multinationals, to support government interventions towards COVID-19. So all along, everyone knew that we have to work in a collaborative manner. And so this was a practical initiative to promote partnerships and collaborations. And so it led to a lot of things. From the financial side, we created what we call the Flexi Fund. And from the non-financial side, we collected various PPEs and any other support materials which were available to support the government efforts. That is one. Two, we've also seen a created exigency for innovation. The sector had to really be innovative to deal with the pandemic. Innovation in terms of how we were dealing with the whole thing. People were working from home. Physical meetings were no longer possible. But you see, life had to move on. So a lot of opportunities came with that, and that also shaped the way we were thinking, because now we had to have a lot of convenings around capacity building on adoption of new technologies to be able to meet the challenges which came with the pandemic. We also saw a lot of, which I'd mentioned in my number one point, a lot of communities come together to support the pandemic challenges, because this pandemic was more at the community level. We saw a lot of private sector come together to support the challenges which were there. We saw a lot of individuals come together. This also meant that for us as EAPN, we had to pull our minds together, pull the network together to ensure that there is easy flow of information. because communication was a challenge. So we created a COVID-19 page, which enabled easy communication, enabled sharing of available data, available opportunities, you know, and anything that could support the pandemic and the challenges which we were facing. So those are some of the what we saw happening in this region and how we responded to them and how it changed our thinking and strategies in terms of, you know, living within the new normal, as you had mentioned. Back to you, Naila.
Thank you so much, Evans. So I wonder, I mean, just to kind of, I have one follow-up question, actually. When you're saying about 62% of your members redirected funding to support COVID initiatives or COVID challenges. Do you know specifically what subsectors that money was going to? I mean, when they say, you know, they're redirecting their funding, what does that go towards?
Thank you so much. Bulk of the funding went into meeting the daily needs, you know. We had a lot of challenges in terms of the PPEs. This pandemic caught everyone unaware. So the basic needs at that early time, and unfortunately right now as we speak, we are on another peak of the second wave. So it's even worse than when the pandemic started. So the daily needs now became beyond food, shelter, and clothing into the PPEs and how, you know, the whole community would survive and interact without really spreading the virus. And so a bulk of that funding went into supporting the PPEs, but then it also depended so much on which sectors the funder was supporting. So those who are in the disability sector directed most of their funding into supporting the disabled at the community level. So a lot of challenges were there. For example, from the disability side, most of the communications the government was channeling was through electronic media. You know, newspapers could not get to the community. So a lot of donors who were in that space had to invest in the translators, you know, so that that information could get to the disabled community. So it all depended on which sectors these funders were working on before the pandemic. And so bulk of that funding went into those areas. We saw a lot of them supporting the those who are in the agricultural sector, supporting, you know, building of the value chain, ensuring that we dealt with food insecurity. Because, you know, a lot of people, the government went into the PPEs, but people forgot that food was very important. So those funders who are in the agricultural space had to invest more in ensuring that we do not get into another crisis after the pandemic. So it all depended on which sector the funders were funding, and bulk of that went into it. The only reallocation that happened, specifically for those who had like discretionary grants and those who had a lot of flexibilities in their funding, went into supporting the PPEs in supporting government interventions toward the pandemic.
Okay, great. Thank you, Evans. And just another, so the second follow-up to that really is, if you're looking forward now, given that you're saying, you know, so you're seeing in the region that there's a second wave coming, okay, so we know that you still have to continue to address these issues. But if you look a little bit further beyond that, what do you see then as the main priorities to continue focusing on, right? Because, I mean, at some point, you have to kind of go back to strategizing beyond the pandemic, correct? So what would you think are like the main priorities in that regard?
I think what has come out pretty clear is that we cannot continue to work in silos. We have to embrace partnerships and collaboration, and we have to walk the talk. And that is what we have been doing this side of the world. So it's beyond saying that, hey guys, we have to pull together, but extending to how do we pull together and what are the practical actionable areas that we can pull together on. So what I'm trying to say is that philanthropy has to reimagine itself. We have to shift and look at structures that will enable us generate new power. We have to look at areas like we have been having conversations around, including today, we were hosting a webinar around participatory grant making and dynamic accountability. When you're going to talk about collaborations and partnerships, then you cannot oversee the elements of accountability and transparency in those conversations and in those relationships. When we are going to reach out to communities, to reach out to the government, to reach out to private sector, then we have to talk about the power imbalance. We have to shift most of these decisions and how to come up with the programs that we are talking about to the communities. We have to look at how do we strengthen the existing institutions, and how do we also create non-existing institutions that will enable the sector to be more responsive. But above all, we have to generate, and we have to craft, and we have to build genuine relationships. If the partnerships have to work, we have to be genuine in the way we interact with each other, in the way we bring out our issues on the table, as we think about building those collaborative, arrangements that we can imagine. So that is where I see philanthropy head to enable it to work very closely with the other actors, to also enable it to work very well within itself, because we are looking at for EAPN, we are looking at 3 levels of partnership. We are looking at partnership within and amongst philanthropy itself. That is philanthropy, partnerships, and collaborations. We are looking at partnerships between philanthropy and the private sector, and then philanthropy and the government. For all those to work, for us to bring, fruits on the table 20 years from today, 30 years from today, then we have to have relationships which are based on honesty, which are based on, dealing with power imbalance, shifting the power to communities, and distributing that power amongst all the players in an equal manner and in a manner that supports the programs that we want to run. Naila.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Evans. Yeah. I mean, I think really that it's often the philanthropy sector talks about partnership building and relationship building and collaborations and cooperation, et cetera. And I think if anything, we all have to acknowledge that this situation, this global situation that we find ourselves in, has absolutely highlighted that as it is time not to just keep saying that, but really we don't have an option, right? Because the continuation of working in silos we'll find ourselves in the next catastrophe facing the same issues again. And so the fostering of those relationships is very important. Thank you so much. I agree. Thank you. Okay, so I'll move on. Evans, I'll come back to you at the next round of questions, but I'll move on now and ask Brad Smith. Hi, Brad, president of Candid, to consider the same questions. If you want me to repeat them, let me know. But okay, great. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Brad.
It's okay. I'm going to share my screen and have just a few images so you're not just looking at my talking head. I also just want to say first, though, that it's really a privilege to be here with GIFE. When I worked with the Ford Foundation in Brazil, I was actually involved in the very first meetings of GIFE, and it's congratulations to you all for all the years of really important work and really growing and professionalizing and philanthropy and social investment in Brazil. And also all the other partners here on the panel. Candid is an organization essentially does for the philanthropic sector what Bloomberg does for the financial markets. We create the information flow that helps make the market. We track the resources between foundations and their partners in both ways. We try to cover the United States comprehensively, and through partnerships, we also cover the work of philanthropy in other parts of the world and increasingly around global issues. So let me move to some slides. All right. Okay. All right, you should be seeing slides. So obviously, let me go back here, wait a sec. So when we think about 2020, I actually want to begin in 2019. Even before the really remarkable year that 2020 has been, the philanthropic sector was being questioned. And it was being questioned in a series of very high profile books by powerful authors. These are just 4 of the books that came out in 2019 and 2020, which were really looking at philanthropy and wealth in a critical fashion. And what the books were really saying, they were questioning they were questioning the global trend that's been going on for decades of the accumulation of so much wealth in the hands of a relatively small group of billionaires, and then how that related to philanthropy. So 3 themes that run through these books is first, that a lot of wealth that is now represented in philanthropy and in extremely high net worth individuals was accumulated through some kind of exploitation of indigenous peoples, people of color, other countries. But whatever kind of exploitation, that was how the wealth was accumulated. The second thing these books were focusing on was that it probably would have been better if these billionaires had paid taxes instead of engaging in philanthropy, because it was tax incentives that really allowed the creation of so much wealth, and that government could do more with these resources than individual philanthropists could. And then the third thing these books were saying, that because of the action of these large philanthropists, they, in establishing their own priorities and their own emphases and focus areas of their giving, they were undermining public policy and actually undermining democracy. So philanthropy was already off to a rough start before the coronavirus hit. And the next few slides, having lived and worked in Brazil a long time and being born and raised in the United States, I never thought that the 2 countries, the United States, would have as much in common as they've had in 2020. Both countries have the unenviable position of being among the countries that have the largest incidence of coronavirus. The picture on the left, a lot of you will recognize as coming from Amazonas state in the north of Brazil. And then, of course, the United States actually has the highest number of cases, infections, hospitalizations, and deaths of any country in the world. Oops, sorry. The other thing that happened, remember coronavirus, it started in China much earlier, but it hit the US and the northern and southern hemisphere in late February, early March. In May, George Floyd, a Black man in Minnesota, was killed by a white policeman. And this sparked a series of nationwide and to a certain extent global demonstrations around the theme that Black Lives Matter, and really protesting the persistence of structural and systemic racism. And of course, in Brazil, just a few days ago, November 19th, João Alberto Silveira Freitas, a Black man, was killed by 2 security guards in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in a Carrefour supermarket store. And I believe it was on the day before, the day after the Dia da Consciência Negra in Brazil. And this also sparked similar kinds of demonstrations, maybe not at the same volume as in the United States, but around the same kind of theme, that Black Lives Matter, vidas negras importan, and protesting historic racism in Brazilian society. As candid, the minute the virus really hit or came to the US and South America, we began to try to immediately collect as much data as we could on what the philanthropic sector was doing in real time in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a challenge because it's difficult to get in real time about what foundations and social investors do. So we really related, maybe this will come up in the questions, but we relied on data science and a lot of relatively sophisticated methods to scrape and pull this information from news and social media and other sources. And we were very quickly able to track a very large and impressive and accelerating amount of spending. And interestingly enough, the earliest spending we saw was China, as that philanthropic sector responded to the pandemic. Then we saw Italy and parts of Europe. Then we saw the United States, and then of course we saw Brazil. And we were able to find a really impressive activity, as our other speakers have talked about, 8 countries in the way that the sector stepped up to deal with coronavirus. After the George Floyd incident and the demonstrations in the United States around racial equity, we turned to the same approach to racial equity to really see how much was being done by foundations and social investors to address racial equity. And remarkably, what we found was the first responders in terms of racial equity, literally within days, less than a week after George Floyd were killed, were actually corporations, some of the biggest corporations in the world. They were Walmart, Apple, PayPal, eBay, stations like National Football League, Adidas, Nike. They were exercising a kind of brand activism. They clearly saw that it was in their best interest as corporate citizens to respond both to the pressures from the society and also, especially from their own workforce, to really put their brand behind racial equity. And then we began to see the foundations respond as well. And we, just in 2020 alone, we've been able to track $11 billion that have been either made in grants or pledges to promote racial equity in the US. And just to give you a comparison, since 2011, when we started information on racial equity, the total we've been able to track is 14.2 billion. So 11 billion of that 14.2 billion came in 2020. So it does show the power of the sector when society and events move the sector to respond in a certain way. We then tried to sort of put these things together, these two kind of mega crises in 1 year. And we began to look at, for all this money that is being put into COVID-19 response, to what extent is it reaching the communities that are most affected and most suffer from COVID? And in most parts of the world, definitely in the United States, those are low-income communities and particular communities of color. And what we were able to find when we actually looked at the data, that philanthropy and social investment was not doing a very good job when it came to COVID-19 of getting that money to the resources, to the communities that most needed. In other words, the same kind of distortions that are present in the society in terms of racial inequity are also they're present in the sector and in the sector's response. And then the last thing I just wanted to, it made us think about is what's behind all this, which is democracy. And let me just move this slide here, sorry. For a number of years, Candid has been tracking how philanthropy is actually working in the US to improve the functioning of the US democratic system on access to voting, the selection of judges to be appointed to the Supreme Court and other parts of the country, how policy is made, government corruption and transparency, rules, the functioning and efficiency of government agencies. And there actually is an impressive, relatively small, but a gift happens every year to function on, that focus on democracy. And one of the trends we're seeing now, because of the recent elections, because of the issues of racism, and because of the problematic response to the pandemic, is philanthropists are beginning to think about larger questions about the weakness of democratic institutions and democratic processes, and to what extent philanthropy, using its independence and its creativity, can help sort of give philanthropy, democracy, the breathing space it needs to really recover its true sense of public and the public purpose.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Brad. It strikes me a little bit that you guys really had your work cut out for you, like the three different things that you were sort of looking at, the pandemic being, one, but then, democracy and racial inequity, and you're looking at all of that in the 1 year where all of these things were under threat. That's, that's a lot. That's intense.
It is.
Yeah, that's intense. So we'll have a little bit more of a chance to hear your views about kind of moving into the future. Your presentation leaves, it leaves a lot to kind of be considered and a lot to be absorbed. So I'll take this on to Charles next, and then we'll come back, and for the second round, I'll ask a little bit more pointed questions about, how do these kind of priorities look like moving into the next phase. So Charles, if you want me to repeat the question again, is just if you can give us, kind of your thoughts on the impact of this pandemic on the sector from your perspective as, as an editor of the Alliance magazine and in the media space, and then also talk a bit about the impact on agendas and strategies, and yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Naila, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone at GIFE and to hear some fascinating presentations. Thanks, Brad and Evans, and indeed Naila. I want to bring to you some of the views of some of the readers of Alliance. We're a philanthropy publication that covers developments and trends in philanthropy around the world. And just by fortuitous timing, we've just actually published a survey yesterday of readers' views and reaction to the current situation. It just seems like a good moment just to bring some of those perspectives in, which are drawn from 250 responses from people in 59 countries around the world, including Brazil. And some of the standout findings actually reflect some of what Brad was just describing in his presentation. So, for example, question about have funding priorities changed this year? We had 39% of respondents saying they're giving more to health, including mental health issues, an increased number committing funds to gender equality and gender justice, but also to racial justice, 19% saying increased commitments to racial justice as well as democracy education. So perhaps not as high as some of the standout figures in the US that Brad was citing, but certainly reflection of philanthropy responding to questions that are being posed by the development of social movements around the world, and philanthropy trying to keep pace with some of these changes. In terms of funding practice, 60% of respondents were saying that they've made more of their funding unrestricted, so shifting to core funding. And there's definitely a question mark about whether the rhetorical shift we're seeing in the sector around providing support for general operating costs is translating into the reality of more core funding. So questions about the extent to which core funding, which is so important to nonprofits, becomes more of an orthodoxy. And it'd be interesting to hear what other people's thoughts are on that. The question about collaboration, that was actually been a feature of all the presentations, but it certainly stood out in relation to what Evans was saying. Is there more of a willingness to collaborate with other foundations, so collaboration within our sector? And almost half of respondents said absolutely there's been an appetite, and only 3% said definitely not, and we're just continuing as we were before. So a greater appetite for collaboration within the sector, and it'll be interesting to see whether between sectors as well. In terms of society's philanthropy's relevance to society, we asked whether you believe this crisis has made philanthropy more relevant to solving society's problems. And 32% said it's made them more relevant than ever, and only 1% saying not really relevant at all. So we are seeing a sense of philanthropy trying to respond to some of the critiques that Brad was highlighting in those books in 2019, particularly coming out of the United States, that was raising some hard questions about philanthropy. And then one important finding that I just wanted to highlight that we actually headlined in our news coverage of the survey findings, and that was around mental health and well-being, but not just in the wider world, but also in our sector. 58% of respondents said that since the onset of COVID, mental health and well-being of people in their organizations had become worse. So I think both as an issue of how personnel in the philanthropy sector are treated and how they feel and how they're managed, and personnel and human resource questions might begin to rise, as well as, of course, a wider philanthropic agenda about mental health, which, of course, will have global differences depending on the context in which people will be working. And all of these kind of observations around collaboration, more core funding and funding practice, but also some of the wider shifts in where philanthropy is investing its funding, bring me to this kind of consideration of a paradox for philanthropy. And I put it like this, in terms of thinking about the priorities and challenges that face the global philanthropy sector. And that is, on the one hand, philanthropy seems more relevant than ever. It has more resources than ever. At a time when government resources are stretched, philanthropic endowments are actually faring quite well and have more money. Of course, comparative sums are vastly different, but philanthropy has resources and therefore a relative position of power. Also, the philanthropy sector is maturing, not just in Brazil, but worldwide. Today, there are 5 conferences taking place today in the philanthropy sector, none of which are in the United States. So the UK's Association of Foundations is meeting today. There's a conference in Switzerland about the relationship of philanthropy and taxation. The European Foundation Centre is convening a group looking at disability. There's a debate about the role of archives in philanthropy. So we're seeing this buoyancy in our sector, this growth, this professionalisation, but at the same time, a wider critique. And I would root that critique in the number 1 priority for the world, or one of the number 1 priorities. Number 2 priority is inequality. And this growth of wealth inequality, the fact that wealthy people have become more wealthy during this pandemic and will be using some of that wealth philanthropically, will raise expectations about what role philanthropy will play and its social contract with the rest of society. So it will be interesting to see whether the critique that Brad was describing, that has been so biting in the US about plutocracy and the power of philanthropy to distort agendas as well as to promote democracy, whether that starts to emerge in other philanthropy sectors where there'll be a question about the role that elites play in society, including philanthropic elites. And then in terms of a priority, I think for everybody, but a big priority going into 2021 for the global philanthropy sector will be its response to the climate crisis and its contribution to engaging in relation to that. We at Alliance have committed to weekly coverage of climate issues in philanthropy throughout the next decade as part of our commitment. But we also realized that our own coverage was only about 2% of the overall coverage we were running in Alliance, and we felt we needed to do better, but also challenge the sector to see more of a focus on climate, which will be, you know, such an important issue going into both this decade, but also next year with the G20, G7, and of course the COP in Glasgow. So we at Alliance will certainly be kind of following our readers and trying to provide more coverage of what's happening in climate, but also, as I've mentioned, other issues around mental health, and also funding practice, which seems to be evolving, and we'll be keeping our eyes on that. So those will be my kind of opening kind of observations, drawing on what our readers are telling us. Back to you, Naila.
Great, thank you so much, Charles. Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things from what you're saying, I think kind of, you know, bring up even bigger questions. One around core funding and donors, you know, releasing more of that money to be unrestricted funding is a big one. I mean, I even like, you know, it's music to my ears to hear you say that, just as an organization that receives funding. and is always begging for core funding, right? I mean, I think anyone that works in this sector knows that that's the hardest kind of funding to get. And it also brings into question a lot of other things around trust in the sector, trust that, you know, when you are a donor and you make a grant to an NGO or an NPO, that do you have enough trust in that organization to, you know, to believe that they will in fact use it appropriately without having to, like, you know, restrict it so prohibitively maybe. And I just wonder, I mean, a question that would come to me is, I wonder if we'll see that this trend carries on beyond a pandemic. Like, do we really have to be in crisis to be allowed to spend the money the best way that we know how? That would be one question, right? You wanted to...
Yeah, just come back on that. Let me just read you a quote from one of the respondents to our survey, who really reflects what you're saying, building back better doesn't just apply to the things foundations fund. It should also apply to foundations themselves. So what that respondent, I think, is calling towards is a reform and change agenda for the philanthropy world itself, both in terms of its funding practice. Evans mentioned participatory grant making, but also diversity and equity issues within the sector, reflecting the world around us, and not just the elites in terms of race, class, or even gender. So, you know, a question around gender justice and equality, both within our sector and outside, as well as racial justice. So I think there is a sense, at least amongst some of the most progressive organizations in philanthropy, and maybe it's more the people that are commenting and on philanthropy, or the umbrella bodies that are pushing their members in this direction. But I think there are pressures that are building a greater scrutiny. And on your point about core funding, I really hope that's the case, that we will see more sustained investment in core funding. And of course, that's what infrastructure bodies can help to also facilitate, because they can make the case about the value that infrastructure, including philanthropy communications infrastructure, provides. But just for regular organizations, in order to be able to perform most effectively, need to be trusted to do the work they do. So this kind of curse of projects and project funding. It's an open question. Brad might have some data on this, because I know there's debates in the States about the extent to which this is happening. So maybe that's one to him, but I hope that addresses some of the points you're raising.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also the other thing that sort of seems to come up from what both, you know, all three of you, Evans, Brad, and even Naina's, her video intervention as well, is this idea that somehow also it seems like this pandemic has been a bit of an equalizer, or actually a complete equalizer, right? In that we're all facing the same kind of thing, but at the same time, it's also allowed a lot of the inequalities to be highlighted somehow. So just even from a very personal, and this doesn't even begin to like look at the kind of issues that this has shown, whether it's in mental health. And I think I'm one of the people that responded to the Alliance survey about mental health, because mine was very much impacted during this, situation, and continues to be in a way. But, you know, issues around gender-based violence, domestic violence, that all these things that you don't necessarily think about beyond just the health crisis, but then start to realize, oh my goodness, you know, this means that, for instance, children that are reliant on school meals, if they're not suddenly being allowed to go to school, what does that mean for their, for their nutritional support, etc. So that's one kind of thing. But it also, this idea that all of us are digitally accessible now, right? And that we all exist in this virtual world, on the one hand, allowed for more equal access. So now we don't have to travel to the big expensive conference. We can just log on to a relatively affordable Zoom site and be able to share a lot of this experience with a much broader base of people. And that kind of also maybe speaks a bit to the building of those partnerships and nurturing and fostering those relationships so that we can leverage them more globally. But then also it's proven in some cases as well to be a bit of an intrusion, right? And so, I mean, I'm just even thinking of, universities that have to put all of their classes online, and kids who have to log on who may not want their professor and the rest of their class in their room or in their home. by having to be constantly sort of on in this virtual space that is also in your private space. So those are just kind of the things that all three of you, while you're speaking, are kind of popping up for me as things that maybe we can, thread them together when we go a little bit further into this conversation. So now I'll just move into the next round of questions. And the guiding question on that is building a little bit on what I asked before around the vision, but I'd urge you to go even a little bit further if you look at what is your vision for philanthropic action, or the philanthropy sector's action moving forward post-pandemic, and I mean really post-pandemic. So maybe one of the things you could reflect on is this concept of how are donors funding institutions, how are donors funding the sector itself, this issue of core funding, etc. And then what should our philanthropy landscape look like in the nearest foreseeable future? And really how far, as you consider that, how far away are we from this vision? And what are the key things that we need to put in place beyond the partnerships and collaborations? What are the key actions that we need to put in place to be, to move more effectively and efficiently in that direction, to reach our kind of ideal? So if I'll just ask them to, if you have the video of Naina, please, if we could play that first. Great, thank you.
Your vision for philanthropic action in the post-pandemic era, how philanthropy should look like in the near future, how far are we from this, and what do we need to do to get moving in that direction? When COVID-19 first struck the region, the philanthropists were amongst the first group who pivoted almost immediately to tackle the first wave of the pandemic. I think this is natural for philanthropists because philanthropic capital reflects the flexibility, innovative nature, and the catalytic characteristics that define how philanthropic capital often acts as first loss and is able to support innovations, even though they may be risky, but if they are pulled off, they have enormous reward. This flexible and more open-minded mindset will be crucial as more and more philanthropic organizations look to support systems change rather than just a specific cause or theme. We are finding that funders are becoming increasingly aware of the multidimensional nature of social and environmental issues. We also see that funders therefore need to design holistic solutions that do not just tackle one aspect or a symptom of an issue, but are rather address complex problems and keep in mind that the failures that have come before them. So for instance, we saw one of our members actually in Europe, Robert Bosch Foundation, that turned itself upside out by reviewing its entire grant strategy last year, by beginning with terminating all its existing grants. This dramatic change and plan to review their strategy stemmed from changing times and evolving needs. Social investors in Asia are also harnessing the resources and lessons they have gained in the region and contributing to this global ecosystem. Forward-looking foundations are having a global impact footprint by partnering with and nurturing their cross-border counterparts to spur greater social innovation. For example, we see Fondation Chanel, a corporate foundation from Europe that is accelerating women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion. In partnership with UN Women, Fondation Chanel has designed a 3-year program that addresses the barriers that women entrepreneurs face in China and in Vietnam. It also partnered with another organization that is part of the AVPN network, Root Impact, to develop a 6-month training program for Korean mothers whose careers have been interrupted due to marriage, childbirth, and other household duties. We also see another Korean member, Crevice, which is an impact ventures group in South Korea, that launched an accelerator program in Indonesia by partnering with a local intermediary in Indonesia, Unlimited, which has a strong local presence in the market. They received huge support from the Korean International Cooperation Agency, or KOICA, an impact investor in South Korea called Merry Year Social Company, MISC, as well as finding local investors in Indonesia. In sharing these trends, I realized that the leading practitioners whom I have mentioned all possess one quality: the capacity to take risks and innovate. I think this is the biggest value that philanthropy can bring to the ecosystem.
Great. Okay. So I'll ask Evans. I'll come back. I'll get back to you now and ask you to please answer the same question and share your thoughts on the same issue, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think before I answer your question, I just want us to appreciate the different contexts under which we are approaching these questions. We are responding from, I know when you look at the Northern America, Southern America, Europe, Asia, I think they are more on an advanced stage in terms of growth of philanthropy as compared to the region where I represent. So some of the issues that I may bring out may not really be issues in other places, but this is what I think. There's this goodwill that has been occasioned by the pandemic that we are facing. So we are seeing the governments of the region appreciating the role of philanthropy in development. We are seeing the private sector seeing the importance of working together with the government and with the philanthropy entities that we are talking about. So on a basic level, everyone agrees that we need to work together. So this is what I see. Now, with that goodwill, I think there presents an opportunity for organizations, for infrastructure support organizations like EAPN, and these other ones, to really pick on the question, and we've already done that as EAPN, some of the issues that we have struggled with as a sector. For example, the issue of enabling environment. Before the pandemic, many governments were squeezing the civil society space. It was very, very difficult to work. And there were a lot of complaints, and any efforts that we had on the table to build an enabling environment were all falling in deaf ears. But now with the pandemic coming along and the challenges that came with it, and the appreciation that everyone now sees that these guys for real are really supporting our efforts as the government. So what we have seen is that it's now an opportunity for us to pick some of those difficult conversations we have been having because the goodwill is there. So that is one. I think the other thing that we need to work on as a sector from this other side of the world is the issue of sharing timely data. And I'm glad Brad is here with us. We've partnered with them before to develop the East Africa Philanthropy Data Portal. And everyone at the moment appreciates the knowledge that we are generating from that portal. Which gaps are existing? What opportunities are presented from those gaps? If I want to come in as a funder, which are the areas that really requires my interest if I'm still having an open check and I'm not really fixed on a specific sector to support, So data sharing, providing very timely information are areas that as a sector we really need to invest in, because that will enable us to sort some of these challenges that we have been facing. Connecting that with the goodwill that I was talking about, before the pandemic, sharing data in this part of the continent was a serious hell of a work. Telling someone that how much money have you given into this cause, which sector are you supporting, how much resources are getting into that was a huge problem. Now with the pandemic, everyone appreciates that we need to share data. We need to know what is going where, which gaps are existing. So to some extent as a sector, I think we really need to appreciate some of the gains and the opportunities that the pandemic has created for us, and take advantage of those. Talking about building of alliances, again, taking advantage of the goodwill that has been created, where everyone now feels that we need to work together. Before, all these were plastic conversations that we were having, but now everyone sees that, hey, we need to pull together. And I can tell you, that a lot of practical examples are already happening in this part of the region. And one of them is people appreciating that we need to explore alternative financing models, you know. And before the session began, I think I had one of my colleagues from the hosts talking about a conversation and a webinar series that they ran around blended finance. We had a similar one a few weeks ago, and the interest that is generated, not just interest, but genuine interest, you know, around the innovations that my colleague was talking about in the video. You know, we have to innovate, we have to take risks as a sector. We have to take risks, we have to explore some of these innovative options that are now coming to the table. In other parts of the world, blended finance has really worked, and it's not a new concept. On this other side of the world, it's now when we are trying to explore and experiment and, you know, take risks around it, see the partners we can pull, and how it can work, and how it can really change lives, and how it can be practical models that can be put on the table around that. But now, one of the things that is coming out is when we talk about the partnerships that we have all mentioned in our conversations, I think the issue is how do we ensure again that those partnerships are sustainable so that they're not just driven by the pandemic that we are facing today, but we ensure that they last for the longest time possible, and we build on them and we make them better, and we use them now as tools and avenues to strengthen development in these areas and communities that we serve. I think there's also the opportunity that the private sector presents, looking at what we are now facing this side of the world. We are seeing many private sector entities looking at philanthropy as vehicles that they can use to channel their resources to the communities. That is another opportunity that as a sector and as players, we need to position ourselves well, talking about those partnerships, talking about how do we look at other alternative sources of resources. You know, we are like Kenya just moved into the developed economies a few years ago, 2 or 3, if I'm not wrong. The other countries in within our network are still in the lower category. And so with the pandemic, where everyone felt that we need to first of all sort out domestic issues in the countries where these fundings were coming from before we look at, you know, those East Africans. And so that also meant that for us as locals here, we needed to look at which other models can we look into, which other avenues can we explore to ensure that we have local resources for local issues. And so for us, that is an area that we are looking into going into the future, and very critical for the conversations that we are having. And then lastly is just ensuring that as a sector, we engage in meaningful, we get into meaningful engagements. Very key for us, ensuring that there's inclusivity and there's participation and responsiveness from all the actors that we need to engage in sorting the issues that we have to sort. Thanks, Naila.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Evans. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, this whole issue around data is so important, and it's so kind of personal for me as well, because the network that I manage, and I know Brad knows this very well because I talk about it all the time, the lack of data in the Arab region around philanthropy and giving is so, I mean, it's such an obvious gap that we have. So I'm also hopeful. I mean, we're just about, you know, my network is just about to embark on a data survey, the largest of its kind. And I'm hoping to build on exactly this interest that you mentioned, Evans, in, you know, wanting to at least highlight the value of having that data to identify gaps, so that when we, you know, are trying to face a situation like this pandemic, we have the information that can, you know, that we can arm ourselves with to do better, quicker, and more effectively. So thank you very much for that. Brad, I'll turn it over to you to say a little bit about this as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just real quickly. Well, I'm really glad that Evans brought up the example of East Africa, because actually, the work that was done in partnership with Evans and others in the region, it probably took 4 to 5 years, I think, before we could actually all reach the point where local social investors and philanthropists in East Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, were comfortable sharing their data and putting it on a platform. There were a lot of issues around, who gets to see the data. We live in environments where we really don't trust what people do with data. There was a lot of very principled, very, very good objections. But one of the things that's really interesting is, how useful it was to have that platform when a pandemic hit, because all the work had already gone into creating the culture of sharing information outside of one own individual foundation or institution. When you're in the middle of a pandemic, it's too late. It's very hard to do that. So, but I just wanted 4 or 5 years to actually get to agreeing to data share. And just to reinforce, I do think, the number one thing that is going to be really, really important for the sector going forward, we're a sector that loves to talk about collaboration. I think Charles, survey shows that, right? Everybody wants to collaborate all the time, right? And we form associations and we go to meetings and we do all that kind of stuff. But the transaction cost of collaborating in our sector are way too high. And when actually people sit down to try to collaborate, they're usually frustrated by how much effort it takes, because they don't have the information, they don't have the systems, they don't have the culture. And again, when there's a crisis, it's too late. So one thing I think the sector really needs to do and could do is invest in its infrastructure, not between crises, not just during or after a crisis, and have a lot of these information systems and practices of sharing in place so that it can be activated when the need happens. I mean, just to give you an example, in this first week after George Floyd was killed in the United States, literally every day corporations were coming out with $100 million, $150 million, all these pledges to do something in racial equity. When this began to filter down from had to do the work in the corporations, we started getting phone calls from some of these corporations, and they were saying, our CEO just committed $100 million for racial equity, and he's mandated us to support organizations that are led by people of color. How do we figure out which organizations are led by people of color? It's an operation and informational question that requires systems and infrastructure in place to be able to answer that. And we're all playing catch up now, and it's good because the demand is there, the money is there. But a lot of times what happens is, in a year like we've had now, the money comes and the commitment comes so fast that in a way the sector is really not ready. So, the one thing I think that would be really important to do is to really invest in creating that infrastructure so that, when our next pandemic hits and our next series of crises hit, we really have these systems in place. The very last thing I'd say is it's a little bit dangerous, as I've learned in this job, to generalize about philanthropy. We usually respond on what we we think philanthropy should do, but philanthropy is very diverse. GIFE does not represent all the social investors in Brazil. No one association of foundations in the United States represents the 90,000. I think the biggest one maybe has. It's a very large idiosyncratic sector made up of very large institutions, a lot of very small institutions, and they're also quite autonomous. So I think we need to look at the way philanthropy moves in long-term trends and not in radical shifts, because it takes quite a bit of time to sort of move along, this very disparate sector that we have.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Charles, over to you.
Yeah, it is indeed a very disparate sector, and attempting to cover what's happening in global philanthropy, I can definitely kind of vouch for that. I would just say in response to Brad that this question about investing in infrastructure is absolutely right, but also we have to look at where that infrastructure is and the distribution of that infrastructure, because most infrastructure funding, despite the challenges you're identifying in the US, is based in the US. So you and your colleagues in the US philanthropy sector have the most advanced infrastructure possible. Just take the philanthropy communications infrastructure, where you have an investment in various philanthropy media there, of a kind that we would wish for the rest of the world. So foundations that rightly invest in US infrastructure can actually risk increasing the imbalances inadvertently, not because they don't want to invest in the rest of the world, but because the US infrastructure sometimes is the prime beneficiary. And of course, that's no fault of your own or anyone's own, but more a point about the need for that investment in infrastructure globally, not just in the US philanthropy sector. And that kind of brings me to my vision for philanthropy. I had the benefit of going last, and therefore I've worked up a very radical 5-point plan for my future vision of philanthropy. So I just wanted to share it with you. The first would be, and get your views and critiques. The first would be a root and branch reform of the way that foundations consider and conduct their investments and their investment policies. So the vast majority of philanthropic capital is in endowments that are managed and invested in global capital markets, in some ways and sometimes in ways that are inconsistent with the very missions of the foundations. And the most kind of obvious case that is raised is around climate, where a foundation might be funding climate issues, but might also be investing in fossil fuels. Now, they might have good reasons and arguments for why they might do that, but I think at the least, I would want to see foundations actively considering those questions and explaining the rationale for their investment policies, as well as being far more transparent about who the investment houses are that they invest in, how much they pay their investment advisors, and how they adopt the approaches they do. So I think this whole question of investments, of which we haven't talked about today, is a really big question for philanthropy. The second item would be an agenda for philanthropy rooted in justice and social justice on issues of climate, race, and gender, and not just externally, but also in terms of foundations' own practices. So talking about issues of the kind of representation of people of color and of women in the most senior roles in foundations and on foundation boards. And just to give you one example in terms of the concentration of power, take the most powerful foundation in the world, the Gates Foundation, spending $3 billion a year. I think there are legitimate questions to ask about the composition of its board, which comprises just 3 people, Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, and Warren Buffett. So, I think there are legitimate questions to ask about whether 3 people should have control of that wealth. Of course, you could argue it's their wealth or it's wealth that's been given to them. But in terms of that wider agenda of kind of justice that I was describing, there might be legitimate questions for philanthropy there, not just at Gates, but just to take that as an example that maybe is a very visible one. The third area would be about risks. And here I agree with Naina Batra, that foundations are at their best when taking risks. But there's also a kind of tension with the whole question of accountability and how the independence that foundations have gives them the freedom to take risks, but also that freedom is partly because they're not accountable in quite the same way as other actors. So I think there's some consideration there. But one area where I think foundations could take more risks is funding and getting behind social movements of the kind that we've seen emerge in recent years. If social movements are at the cutting edge of where social and political change is going, why is it that less than 1% or less than half of 1% of all philanthropy goes to fund social movements, according to Candid's own data? And of course, social movements might be of different political orientations. So, you might like one social movement and I might like another, and they might be doing opposing things or calling for opposing things. But if philanthropy is going to be relevant to society, then its engagement with the social movements of our time is going to be important. And of course, doing so in a way that doesn't turn them into NGOs, which they don't want. So finding the right ways to do that. So those are the first 3. And then just 2 more, if I may. One would be about in my future vision of philanthropy, core funding being the default. And when that default isn't met of providing core multi-year funding, there might be that foundations are willing to explain their rationale for other approaches and choices, which can be legitimate in certain circumstances, but maybe inverting the current reality in favor of doing what nonprofits are calling for. And with that, a democratization of funding practice, whether that's participatory grant making, whether it's having the people that benefit from funding, not just on expert panels, but on the board of, say, the Gates Foundation or other foundations. So really bringing in the people that philanthropy is supposedly benefiting into the heart of the decision-making process of funding as part of that revolution in funding practice. And there's obviously a long way to go there. And then finally, and this really relates to what I was saying in my opening comments, the ability to make sure that in philanthropy there's a space to speak truth to power, but do so in a way that's constructive, that's nuanced, and well evidenced. And that's where I think, as part of the philanthropy infrastructure, the communications infrastructure in philanthropy is important. Not just Alliance magazine, but philanthropy publications and journals and journalism about philanthropy that can ask those questions about philanthropy, but do so as a critical friend, holding up a mirror to our field, not simply either demonizing all philanthropy or celebrating it uncritically, but actually provide the kind of space for that kind of nuanced coverage and consideration that is, I think, and hope others would agree, is really needed in a field that maybe doesn't have the classic feedback mechanisms one would expect. So that would be my 5-point plan for future of philanthropy. I'm interested to see whether it resonates with any of you on the panel or listening in Brazil. Thank you.
Yeah, Charles, thank you so much. I think I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to ask you to put this in writing. I think that you absolutely have to put this 5-point plan in your next issue, please, and so that we can share it. I'm really serious, because I mean, I think it should go beyond just this web hour. That would be wonderful, because I think you come up with some very, very good points, and it's kind of accessible, right? Because this sort of thinking of the future is a bit of an overwhelming task at this point. I mean, we can barely think to next week, right? We can barely think what we're going to do over Christmas. So I just think that, that would be a big service, a big favor that you'd be doing all of us, if you could share that a little bit more widely. So I'm very conscious of our time, and I want to be able to get to the questions from the audience. So I'm going to just launch right into those. Let me see. So far, we have 3 kind of, big questions. So let me go to Brad first and ask you, there's a question from Anna, which says, I wish Brad could talk a bit more about the reflection and provocation that you brought forward around taxes versus philanthropy, or taxes towards philanthropy. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because I think actually that would also be interesting for many of us, even for us in the Arab region, where we don't have that incentive. So that would be an interesting reflection. Please go ahead.
Right. Well, in a number of countries in the world, particularly the U.S., but not only the U.S., philanthropy operates under essentially a kind of social contract, right, in which philanthropic organizations are exempt, and nonprofits from paying certain taxes in exchange. And the public good is very loosely defined, usually by the tax authorities as a charitable purpose or something. But these books that I mentioned, at the beginning of my presentation, brought back a theme which comes back, every few years in American society and outside. Actually, it's the principal argument for not giving tax incentives in most countries. Like, I know historically that was the argument in Brazil, to not giving tax incentives to philanthropy, really, that the government needs these resources, and that the government, which is democratically elected, has more accountability and is better equipped to use these resources than relatively unaccountable private institutions that somehow are supposed to serve the public good. I think the problem with that argument is, sorry, there's a phone going off. I can't do anything about that. But the problem with that argument really is that it, I'm sorry, this is a spam phone call. Yeah. The problem with that argument is that it uses two ideal extremes. So it posits an idealized form of where if government only had enough revenue, it would do all the right things that the people want and need. It also posits sort of an idealized form of the market that, is somehow if the market functioned perfectly, wealth would be distributed and no one would have any problems. And it probably distorts a view of philanthropy. So I think, we need to find our way through this public policy maze we're in with the governments we actually have in practice, which are often less than ideal. The philanthropic institutions we have, which very few of which have managed to comply with all of Charles's 5 points. And the market imperfections we have. So there's no clear answer to that question. But this is a big debate in societies around taxation. And I do think actually globally, the international community needs to look a lot more closely at taxation as really, part of the way you deal with really large global issues.
Great. Thank you, Brad. So, well, there was a follow-up. I'm just seeing now a follow-up question to that, where maybe more like a statement, but saying that due to the existence of the mismanagement in public sector, would that result be? So I guess that's sort of what you're touching on as well, right? And one of the arguments against it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's the biggest argument against lots of tax dollars going to the government: corruption, inefficiency, all sorts of things. So this idea that somehow you have a perfect government that will equally allocate resources, and
if only,
if only,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting also because like in the Arab region, part of the reason why there isn't this tax incentive isn't anything. I mean, I don't know if it even addresses the issue around government mismanagement of taxes or not, but it's really more around the anonymity of giving in the region culturally, right? Because of the association with religious giving, which is meant to be anonymous. So there are different reasons, and again, that kind of speaks to the variety of the different cultures of philanthropy around the world. So, okay, another question. Some of these questions are for all panelists, so I'll keep it open and see who of you would like to answer. But we have one question from Rafael saying, Amartya Sen launched the economic questions for the supply of mechanisms for hunger, and how can we apply her theories in post-pandemic philanthropy to be more efficient? So if any of you are familiar with Amartya Sen's economic questions, you can answer that, or you can just answer it from your own perspectives. Any takers? Brad?
Amartya Sen wrote, has lots of really important theories about lots of things. But if I remember correctly, when he was talking about hunger, he mentioned that that there was no democracy had ever experienced a famine. So one of the things he was posing on was actually political structures and access and representation of population groups in determining public policy to being one of the best, greatest sort of safeguards against extreme hunger and poverty. Beyond that, I can't remember all the argument of his book.
Okay. And then let's see, here's another one. And actually, maybe Evans, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, but Greta asks, what are your perspectives around the new mechanisms such as blended finance to mobilize new capital and to strengthen philanthropy? And then she also asks, how do you see this issue in Latin America as compared to other regions in the world? So, I mean, for you, it would really be more, how do you see it from the East Africa perspective as compared to the rest of the world, but maybe that can, will have some similarities as well with Latin America. So Evans, if you'd like to respond to that or say anything about that.
Thanks, Nina. For us, this is a new concept to most of the actors within the philanthropy space, but it's not new to some organizations who are having working presence in, for example, Asia, where and Europe, where this is already a concept being applied. So it's being practiced by that few group of organizations, but in the larger local ecosystem, it's a challenge. It's totally new. But what we are already finding is that there's a lot of interest in it because people want to explore the alternative financing models. People want to tap into the non-traditional sources of financing. So it is one, we are excited about it as the APN because it's very innovative. It really embraces a lot of innovation. It's really challenging in that it's something new and worth trying. So for us, we are facilitating conversations and practical, applicable examples that we can push and encourage the sector to adopt. Looking at, so we've started with a few, we've mapped the sector and we have looked at the banks, players from the philanthropy space, the private sector, a few of government agencies to just experiment with already existing models, which are already being practiced, for example, in some parts of Kenya. We want to see how that works out. So I wouldn't say that we have a lot of knowledge around it or a lot of information around it. In fact, in the last meeting that we had last week or the other week, one of the challenges which was presented to us as EAPN is to look at how to generate knowledge around it because there's no existing knowledge, So it's a new area that we are exploring. And I think probably in the next 5 or so years, we should be able to talk more vividly about it from an experience point of view. But for now, that's where we are.
Okay, Charles or Brad, do either of you want to comment on this or should I go on to the next one? Just nod if you want to.
Go on the next one.
Okay, all right. So then the next question is from Paula. Hi, Paula. So Paula wanted to ask, using Candid as an example, how do you see mergers in the nonprofit sector? And do you believe that mergers can actually help increase efficiency in the sector globally? So Brad, I'll ask you to answer that first.
Yeah. Okay. The short answer is yes. There's a lot of duplication, obviously, in the sector. Almost one of the things you realize when you work in a social investor or a funder, and you're working whatever issue you're working on, food, violence against women, whatever the issue may be, you often realize you see a broad view of all the different organizations and initiatives that are working on that issue. And sometimes you know more about all those than each one of the individual organizations know about each other. And sometimes you find yourself in the interesting situation of introducing groups that are working on the same issues that didn't know about each other's work. So there's a lot of duplication in the nonprofit sector. There's also a lot of duplication in the philanthropic sector. It's a little bit harder to address there just because of the nature of philanthropy. A philanthropy is usually created by a successful business person that goes off and creates a philanthropy, or is actually part of a business. And it very much carries the identity of that business and that brand and that individual with them. But the mergers, yes. I think the mergers can help. They're not easy. They take a lot of work. They take a lot of planning. In the case, I won't go into the specific case of the merger of Foundation Center and GuideStar. They created conversations that went on for 10 years. And there were feasibility studies along the way. There were a lot of careful planning. The one advantage we have in our sector, though, is that we actually can take the time to do it well. We don't have, share price. We don't have to worry about information getting out. We don't have to be rated by, you know, a venture investor or something that's going to take us over and, you know, is sensing weakness. So we can actually take the time to do it right, because our assets are not owned by individuals. They're owned essentially by the public or by the organization itself. So yes, I think it is something that is really promising. Be done right, and it has to be done with care and hopefully with sufficient resources. The one thing I will say is that you should not think of doing it if you're doing it because there's one strong there's two weak organizations, and your hope is to make one strong organization out of them. And probably not even if you have one strong organization and one weak organization, because you'll probably end up creating one sort of, you know, not so weak or not so strong organization. There really has to be a very clear vision of what the value proposition is and how it's really going to benefit the public.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Charles or Evans, do either one of you want to comment on this as well, in the, you know, regarding the question of mergers in the philanthropic sector?
I'm happy to just briefly on this. There's an old saying: "There's no such thing as a merger, only a takeover." So I wonder whether, in the case of Candid, you know, the story of how that played out over 10 years occurred will be an interesting case study, an important one for the foundation community. So I'm sure archival researchers will want to understand that someday in the not too distant future. But what Brad was saying about having the ability to take time over these mergers is also a challenge, because there's no impetus for change. There's no mechanism for efficiencies unless they're voluntarily kind of desired by the people involved. Or maybe there might be some impetuses, but they might not be as sharp as the ones of the market that Brad was referring to. Just on mergers and overlaps and duplications, it might be really useful. I'm just thinking of Evans now, of a conundrum that I've struggled to understand in relation to the African context, and maybe you can throw light on this, that there is African Philanthropy Network. There's also the Africa Philanthropy Forum, neither of which is the organization that you work for. So, I mean, what the story of that might tell us something about the very question we're asking. So I guess I'm putting my journalistic hat on there by asking a question rather than answering them, but maybe I should just mute myself now and hear what you've got to say.
You've put me on the spot. I was really praying that the conversation doesn't get into where you've taken it to, but now that it has come, we have to deal with it, you know. So I have to agree with you. There's a lot of duplications and overlaps within the philanthropy space, within the networks that we serve. You've mentioned about the Africa Philanthropy Forum, the Africa Philanthropy Network. Again, a lot of overlaps, and we see a lot of duplication of roles and responsibilities. But all the same, I think one thing that when we heard about rumors, you know, it started as a rumor somewhere that there was that merger that is now currently Candid, and everyone was like, okay, let's wait and see. And here it is today, looking very successful. And so I would really be interested. That would be an interesting case study, because it's one of the practical examples that we are seeing today. So I'd really be interested in just getting to know, maybe someone should do a case study on it. But coming back to the question of mergers, for me, I have always been an advocate of, you know, if we can eradicate duplications, the better. But then now the flip side of that one is the politics around it. You know, it's not that it's easy to say, but very difficult to actualize, you know, because who seeds what? You know, that has been the challenge. And this, I think the mergers is even a far-fetched conversation. Look at it from the side of collaborations and partnerships. that in itself has been a challenge. Looking at two organizations which really look to be performing similar responsibilities, even having them on the same table to discuss about partnerships and collaborations is quite a challenge and requires a lot of efforts and managing power issues. So it's a big challenge, but a very important consideration that we need to make as a sector. For us to eradicate, I look at East Africa, for example, there are so many emerging outfits that I feel are totally unnecessary, but then they are there. So hopefully when the sector grows and the space grows and people see that, okay, this doesn't need to exist because that already exists, or the two need to come together and really advance this issue or advance an agenda in a collaborative manner, we'll get there. But I agree with you, the duplications, the overlaps, the best way to eradicate it are only two: embrace partnerships and collaborations, or merge.
Yeah.
Let me actually add to a sixth point to Charles' 5-point plan for philanthropy. And just to, merger is sort of like, at the far end of a continuum of collaboration and partnership. And the biggest thing, without getting into details, I learned in this merger process that produced Candid, was the value of actually, the way you learn to do something like this is by doing one concrete thing together. And a lot of times along the way, we actually learned we could collaborate, because when we decided it was too early to do it, we actually started working on some very concrete problems both organizations had together, and we learned trust. It's like a human relationship. You just learn by doing things together. Our sector, and this is my sixth point, we should abolish the MOU. Tends to, write up elaborate memorandums of understanding, collaboration agreements that become the end product. There's, very little is actually done after that, rather than actually doing something concrete together and then sort of letting the structure of the collaboration and the partnership all the way up to merger evolve. So just identify one thing you can do together and do it, and you'll learn a lot.
Great. Charles, I hope you're writing that down, because it's going to have to go in your article. Now it's the 6 things that philanthropy can do to improve itself.
Sounds like it's
okay.
going to be a co-authored piece at this rate.
Listen, wasn't I the one that yeah, absolutely. You should absolutely do that. So, okay, we have about 4 minutes left. So I want to make sure that we get, we hit it on time. I don't want to keep people over time. And I want to just ask the 3 of you if there's any final thoughts that you'd like to kind of give. If each of you could take like 30 seconds, just sort of give your final thoughts if you have them. No pressure if you don't. And then I'll move on to just closing out the show. So go ahead. Charles, I'll ask you to go first if you have anything to say. Unmute. You're on mute.
Thank you. I haven't read Amartya Sen, but a philosopher that has played an important role in my thinking about philanthropy is John Rawls. And Rawls wrote about ideas of justice and what that means in relation to the role of the state as well as philanthropy. So some of my thinking about the way that philanthropy might reform and develop is reflective of that. And that might mean a reconsideration of some of those questions about the tax privileges of philanthropy. That the space for philanthropy and civil society should remain and be sustained, but pursuing the value of giving as an end in itself is a good one, but maybe doesn't need the tax benefits it has in order to sustain it. And that, I know, it would be a controversial thing in the sector, but maybe something that Rawls, if he was here, might suggest himself.
Great, thank you. Evans, go ahead, your final thoughts.
We are currently doing our strategic plan, and it's such a difficult process because of the uncertainties. No one is sure about tomorrow. And so that futuristic thinking process is something that we really need to coalesce together as a sector, learn from each other, strategize together, and collectively act as a sector for the growth of the space that we are serving. We need to really continue strengthening the infrastructure, strengthen the institutions that exist, and create those ones which do not exist to meet the gaps that exist, and really embrace accountability and build the trust of the public to the sector so that we can collectively deal with the issues that we are dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evans. Brad, your final thoughts.
Yeah, just for all of us that are in this social sector and working in philanthropy and social investment, I mean, it's a real privilege. And we're in a growth industry. And that's exactly where you want to be in terms of your life and your profession in an industry that's growing. And I think, the big lesson from 2020 is just how essential this sector is of the solution to the problems we're facing. If we just take the vaccine, for example, the vaccine development is a really, great example of philanthropic funds, government policy and regulation, and private sector initiative. And I think if we've learned anything from this year is that when the world really gets in trouble, and there's a lot of ways the world is getting into trouble in terms of the weakening of democratic institutions, climate, pandemics, there's lots of things, I think, racial inequity. It really takes these kinds of partnerships and a vibrant social sector to play its role. So this is the big takeaway that I've learned from this year. Probably more so than ever, this sector is essential.
Great, agreed. Evans, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just add one thing that within the moments that we've taken to organize quite a lot of convenings towards supporting the sector, one thing that is coming out is that all the challenges that we are dealing with, this pandemic and many more, God forbid, that may come on our way in the near future, one thing that is coming out very clearly is that the leadership of most institutions are equally struggling. So one area that we really need to look into, how do we build resilient leadership within the sector? I think that's also a crucial area that we really need to see how to support, build capacity, and reposition for a better sector going into the future.
And Naila, just before we finish, may I just add just two very quick comments, and they're just related to Alliance. And that is, we are looking for more perspectives and views from people in South America, particularly in Brazil and elsewhere. So we really will welcome, hearing more about what's happening in your part of the world. And the second point, just building off what Brad said, our new issue next week is actually covering some of the developments that Brad was referring to about vaccine development, because we've dedicated the issue to global health philanthropy and upended our plans to do that. And the issue comes out on Tuesday. So I hope that might be useful material for some of you in terms of some of the debates we're having today. So I just wanted to end with both an appeal for you to submit perspectives to Alliance and also to read more about global philanthropy, health philanthropy on our pages. So thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, all three of you. And to Naina, obviously, thanks as well in absentia. So the last thing before we kind of close out is just to ask Anna, I want Anna to show us the word cloud of what came up from all the participants. And then after that, Erica will say final closing words and we'll end the session. So thank you all so much for indulging us and allowing us to have this extremely rich conversation. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to GIFE for the invitation. So go ahead, Anna.
Obrigada, Naila. Obrigada a todos os nossos palestrantes de hoje por trazer esse panorama global. Vou compartilhar aqui minha tela para vocês com a nossa nuvem de hoje. Bom, nós perguntamos aí para o pessoal, né, considerando o panorama global da filantropia, qual é a principal fronteira do setor em âmbito global? Pensando também no tema do nosso congresso desse ano, que é Fronteiras da Ação Coletiva. A palavra que mais se destacou aí na nossa nuvem é colaboração, e seguida aí de outras palavras que também se destacaram bastante, que é confiança, transformação, impacto e comunicação. Também apareceu bastante inovação e transformação. Bom, essas foram algumas... foram as contribuições do pessoal que está acompanhando a mesa, e nós vamos guardar esse registro lá junto com os outros registros dessa mesa, vai ficar disponível no site do Congresso. Para a gente terminar aqui de vez nosso painel, eu queria agradecer muito, muito a presença de vocês. Thank you, Brett, Naila, Charles, Evans e Naina também. Foi ótimo, foi muito bom ouvir vocês. Essa era uma conversa para fechar essa série, e a proposta era, de fato, trazer um panorama da filantropia em nível global para quem trabalha nesse setor aqui no Brasil. Acho que vocês fizeram isso brilhantemente. Eu fiquei aqui anotando várias coisas, e acho que, apesar de, como o Ivans falou, de a gente estar em cada região, em cada país, em um estágio um pouco diferente, né? Cada um tem aí a sua história de filantropia e tem os seus desafios regionais, né? Territoriais, locais. Acho que a gente tem desafios globais bastante comuns aí na fala de vocês, e muito conectados com o que a gente tem visto como fronteiras do setor, como desafios da filantropia e do investimento social brasileiro. Então, vou terminar destacando aqui algumas das coisas que eu anotei aqui, né? Então, o tema da colaboração, certamente, né? O GIFE acabou de publicar um livro sobre filantropia colaborativa, e acho que a colaboração como uma tendência, mas a colaboração também ainda como um grande desafio, né? Acho que foi o Brad que falou, né? Sim, a gente tem que colaborar, mas como faz isso? Né? Como é que isso acontece na prática e é efetivo na prática? Né? Acho que a gente tem um longo caminho aí para trilhar ainda no que diz respeito a uma colaboração que seja de fato mais efetiva e tenha mais impacto, seja transformadora, e para isso a gente tem que testar e, enfim, inovar, e vai errar, né? E vai errar e precisa tentar de novo, né? O outro tema aqui que a gente também tem debatido muito é sobre fundos restritos e fortalecimento da sociedade civil organizada, né? Então, como é que a gente faz novas formas de grant making que de fato fortaleçam as organizações da sociedade civil, né? Que foi um outro tema que vocês trouxeram. A questão dos dados, né? E não só dos dados em si, dos números, mas da produção de conhecimento, da sistematização de conhecimento e do acesso a esse conhecimento, né? Acho que não só ter o dado, mas como é que a gente torna ele acessível e fácil, né? E como é que a gente também pensa novas formas de produzir dados, né? E acho que a pandemia foi um exemplo bastante grande disso, né? E por fim, aqui a questão da infraestrutura, né? De que a gente precisa investir em infraestrutura, né? E aí eu saio daqui pensando, né? Por um lado apareceu aí alguma coisa de que a gente tem ações que são às vezes duplicadas e tal, versus o investimento em infraestrutura, né? Talvez a gente precise também refletir um pouco sobre quais são os nossos gaps de infraestrutura aí, para poder cobrir esses gaps, né? Ao invés de ter redes e infraestrutura que se duplicam, né? E por fim, eu acompanhei muito, além do Congresso, acompanhei muito esse ano, né? Toda a ação emergencial da pandemia da filantropia no Brasil, né? Pelo GIFE também, como coordenando as ações do GIFE nesse âmbito, e acho que termino aqui com o que todos vocês trouxeram, né? Acho que o processo desse ano tão difícil que a gente viveu como uma oportunidade para a filantropia, né? Tanto no sentido de ter tido um papel muito fundamental, né? Então, acho que de um reconhecimento maior da ação da filantropia a partir das ações emergenciais que dialogam aí com a pandemia, como uma oportunidade para a filantropia também incorporar várias das coisas que ela conseguiu implementar ao longo desse ano, né? Que isso possa vir para ficar, de fato, né? Que a gente possa fazer aí uma aceleração, né? Em coisas que a gente já vinha melhorando, vinha desenvolvendo, mas ainda numa velocidade talvez que pode ser maior, né? Então que essas coisas boas, digamos, né? Que o setor conseguiu incorporar esse ano possam permanecer aí nos próximos anos. É isso. Muito obrigada, gente. Foi um prazer enorme ter vocês aqui. Tenho certeza que todo mundo gostou bastante. Esse painel vai estar disponível no canal do YouTube do GIFE também, que a gente e no e no site do Congresso GIFE, e faremos chegar os 6 pontos construídos aqui coletivamente também, para todo mundo aqui no Brasil. É isso aí, muito obrigada.
Então, quero
Ok.
aproveitar para convidar
Tchau.
todo mundo para o nosso último evento do ano. Esse foi o último webhour dessa série de temas do investimento social privado, e na semana que vem a gente tem o último evento da série sobre pautas da agenda pública. E vai ser sobre o tema equidade racial, em parceria com a rede temática de equidade racial, na quarta-feira, dia 2, às 10 da manhã. Para se inscrever, basta entrar lá no site do congressogif.org.br.
Boa, Ana, eu tinha esquecido do convite para os próximos... para o próximo evento, para o nosso evento de encerramento aí do ano.
Manda o convite, tá?
Tá bom, mandaremos o convite, Brad. É isso aí, gente. Muito obrigada. Até a próxima.
Tchau, tchau.